From the dust of ancient river valleys to the iron rails that stitched continents together, empires have shaped the world we live in. They rose on ambition, innovation, and a promise of order, and they fell to the same forces that made them great: overreach, corruption, cultural friction, and sudden catastrophe. Today we travel fast through time, not as a dry lecture, but as a story of brilliant leaders, hubristic decisions, everyday people swept into events larger than themselves, and the echoes those empires left behind. Imagine standing at each empire's edge and listening for the first creak of change. Let us begin. Picture the world before empires: scattered tribes, small city-states, human communities tied tightly to local landscapes. Then humans learned to farm, to store a surplus, and to organize labor. This quiet revolution created the first seedbeds of empire. Somewhere between the Tigris and Euphrates, in the Fertile Crescent, a new form of power took shape. Mesopotamia birthed cities, writing, and law. Kingship grew into an institution, temples became treasuries, and networks of trade slowly expanded control beyond villages into provinces. The first empires were born when rulers could extract resources, project force, and manage complexity across distance. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon was one of the earliest experiments in ruling diverse peoples from a single center. It showed the promise and the fragility of imposed unity. Communication was slow, loyalties were local, and the machinery of rule depended on strong personalities. When those personalities vanished or the supply lines frayed, so did the empire. Move southeast to the Indus, where cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro reveal the same pattern: urban planning, trade, and central coordination. Wherever surplus and administration intersected, the stage was set for empire, ambitious rulers leveraging new technologies, commerce, and ideas to bind people together. Over centuries, those binding techniques evolved. Empires learned to borrow what worked from neighbors: writing systems, legal codes, religious rituals, bureaucratic methods. That cross-pollination accelerated growth and also made empires more alike and therefore more predictable in their weaknesses. Fast forward to the Mediterranean, where amid rocky shores an empire of a different kind arose: classical Rome. Rome's genius lay in law and administration. It expanded not only by conquest, but through incorporation, granting rights, building roads, and creating a shared civic identity that often felt stronger than conquest alone. Legions became symbols of order. Engineers laid down roads that carried goods and ideas as efficiently as armies. For a time, Rome seemed eternal. Yet its fall teaches a central lesson: scale magnifies small problems. Administrative expense, political instability, and economic strain, including a reliance on slave labor and widening inequality, gradually hollowed an empire of immense capability. External pressures, migrating peoples, border raids, and rival powers compounded the internal rot. Rome's story is partly tragic because so much of what made it powerful resisted easy reform. The machinery was magnificent, but the political will to reinvent institutions in time was lacking. Flip the map to the east and meet another model: China. Unlike Rome, Chinese dynasties cycled through rises and falls with a different rhythm. The mandate of heaven gave rulers a moral framework for legitimacy. Prosperity and good governance meant heavenly approval. Disaster and corruption meant it had been withdrawn. This narrative turned political change into moral drama. Chinese empires built enduring bureaucracies, pioneered paper, canals, and printing, and developed administrative sophistication that often outpaced contemporaries. The Tang and Song dynasties became epicenters of culture and innovation, sending technologies, goods, and ideas along the Silk Road to distant lands. But Chinese imperial history also shows the danger of stagnation. When elites close ranks, when tax farming or land concentration replaces reforms, popular unrest and regional fragmentation follow. Plagues, peasant revolts, and regional warlords could topple dynasties as surely as foreign invaders. Travel south to the Indian subcontinent and find a tapestry of kingdoms and empires: Maurya, Gupta, Mughal. The Mughals, arriving from Central Asia, fused Persian court culture with local Indian traditions, producing courts of astonishing art and architecture. They governed through alliances with local elites, efficient revenue systems, and cultural synthesis. Yet, empire building through cultural fusion always carries a paradox. Unity can be fragile when rulers fail to balance central authority with regional autonomy. Religious policy, tax demands, and succession disputes often inflame tensions that, over time, unstitched even the grandest tapestry. Across the Sahara empires of West Africa, Ghana, Mali, Songhai remind us that centers of wealth and power can also arise in surprising places. Mali's Mansa Musa famously redistributed wealth on his pilgrimage, dazzling the Mediterranean world and demonstrating how trade networks across desert, sea, and river could funnel riches and ideas into regions far from classical heartlands. But like all empires dependent on trade, shifts in routes or the rise of new competitors could undermine them. The trans-Saharan routes that enriched West Africa were eventually overshadowed by Atlantic trade routes, reshaping global economic patterns and shifting centers of power. Empires of the Americas, the Maya, Aztec, Inca, followed a distinct trajectory because they developed largely in isolation from Afro-Eurasian contacts until the late 15th century. The Incas built an astonishingly integrated state across the Andes, knitting disparate peoples together with roads, storehouses, and a labor system that mobilized entire communities. The Aztecs forged a tributary empire based on a network of conquered city-states. Their temples, marketplaces, and ritual life were vibrant demonstrations of centralized power. When Europeans arrived, however, the fragile seams of these systems, partly strained by internal dissent, disease, and rigid social hierarchies, were exploited with deadly efficiency. Smallpox and other diseases to which indigenous populations had no immunity ravaged societies and erased military advantages overnight. The Americas offer a devastating example of how external shocks can accelerate collapse when internal cohesion is already under stress. The Age of Empires enters a new phase with the maritime expansions of Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, Britain, and France. Naval technology, gunpowder, and the pursuit of global trade transformed imperial scale and ambition. Empires now reached across oceans, establishing colonies, trade posts, and complex administrative systems that extracted resources at unprecedented rates. The British Empire, in particular, refined indirect rule in many places, governing through local elites, integrating global commerce, and spreading legal and educational systems that would outlast direct control. Empires enriched their metropoles and created global networks of exchange, but they also entrenched inequality, displaced cultures, and triggered resistance movements. Economic exploitation, plantation economies, resource extraction, forced labor generated immense wealth simultaneously with deep human suffering. Why do empires fall? Historians point to common mechanisms: overextension, where borders become too long to defend and supply; fiscal strain, when the costs of administration and warfare outpace revenue; elite decay, where ruling classes lose legitimacy or become captured by self-interest; and social fragmentation, when subjugated peoples resist or when internal divisions widen. Environmental factors, droughts, soil exhaustion, pandemics accelerate those processes. Crucially, technology both builds empires and threatens them. Innovations like gunpowder, steam power, or global shipping allowed empires to expand, but those same technologies spread to rivals and subjects, enabling resistance and generating arms races that make stability fleeting. Consider the Ottoman Empire, which lasted for centuries by fusing military prowess, administrative flexibility, and religious legitimacy. It adapted taxation, legal pluralism, and a standing army, projecting power from the Balkans to the Arabian deserts. But by the 19th century, nationalist movements, military defeats, and economic dependency on Europe exposed its weaknesses. The Ottoman story is a slow collapse, an empire that modernized imperfectly and paid dearly for it. The Russian Empire expanded across Siberia to the Pacific, harnessing land power, resource extraction, and a centralized autocracy. Yet the pressures of industrialization, social inequality, and the strains of global war produced revolutionary conditions. The Russian Revolution shows how modern empires can implode from within when political institutions fail to accommodate rapid social change. Throughout this sweep, one recurring pattern stands out. Empires that survive longest combine coercion with consent, build institutions able to adapt, and allow incorporation of diverse peoples into a shared political framework. But when rulers rely too heavily on force, economic extraction, or ideological exclusion, they make their subjects' consent brittle. The consent can look genuine rituals, titles, and laws, but beneath it, discontent can simmer until triggered by crisis. Let us zoom in on a few dramatic turning points. The Black Death in the 14th century killed a third of Europe's population in some regions. Labor shortages shifted bargaining power toward peasants, undermining feudal structures and accelerating social change. In China, plagues contributed to the fall of the Yuan dynasty and the rise of the Ming. Pandemics are blunt instruments that reshape demographic and economic equilibria. Empires that cannot adapt to sudden population shifts lose crucial manpower and tax bases. Colonial independence movements of the 19th and 20th centuries flipped imperial dynamics. Once subject elites gained education and political awareness, they used European political ideas, liberty, equality, self-government, against colonial rule. World wars exposed imperial metropoles to new vulnerabilities, heavy casualties, economic strain, and rising expectations for self-determination among colonized peoples. The British Empire, stretched thin by 2 world wars, gradually retreated, granting independence across Asia and Africa, but decolonization did not erase imperial legacies. Borders drawn by imperial fiat, economic dependencies, and cultural transformations continued to shape post-colonial states. Empires also leave ambiguous cultural legacies. Architecture, legal systems, languages, and technologies often survive conquest and become part of the fabric of successor states. Latin seeds, modern legal codes across Europe and the Americas, roads and aqueducts once built by Rome continue to structure cities. In India, railways and English-language institutions had roots in colonial rule but became tools for modernization after independence. Cultural mixing produced new art, cuisine, and religious syntheses that outlived political control. Yet, those legacies can carry painful memories of exploitation, dispossession, and cultural loss. The human cost of empire, slavery, forced migration, cultural destruction is woven into the monuments empires left behind. What are modern empires? Formal colonial empires receded in the 20th century, but imperial dynamics persist in new forms: economic dominance, cultural influence, geopolitical spheres. Think of global corporations that control supply chains across continents, or superpowers whose military bases circle the world. Soft power, media, education, and aid can extend influence as effectively as traditional colonial machinery. In that sense, we still live with empires, though their logos and instruments have changed. So what lessons should we take from 2,000 years of imperial rise and fall? First, institutions matter. Empires that invest in durable, adaptable institutions, law, impartial administration, merit-based governance survive crises better than those resting on personal rule or coercion alone. Second, legitimacy is not optional. Coercion can produce compliance, but broad-based legitimacy stabilizes rule over generations. Third, resilience requires balance. Central power must be strong but also flexible enough to incorporate regional differences and adapt to change. Finally, the human dimension, justice, equality, legitimate representation, shapes long-term stability more than short-term extraction. As we close this panoramic journey, think of empire not as an anomaly, but as a recurring experiment in organizing human societies at scale. Empires reveal both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human folly. They built roads, codified laws, and inspired art. They also plundered, displaced, and suppressed. Their rise and fall is not a simple morality play with clear villains and heroes. It is a complex story of contingency, innovation, greed, courage, and compromise. Imagine standing today at the rim of history, listening to the distant echoes of empires. The monuments, ruined columns, palace walls, ancient roads are not just relics. They are arguments about how we should live together. Will our modern institutions learn from their predecessors? Will we design systems that balance power with accountability, ambition with restraint, prosperity with justice? The fate of past empires urges humility. No system is invincible, but it also offers hope. Whatever falls can be rebuilt in better form, provided we heed the hard lessons and place human dignity at the center of political order. The story of empires is ultimately the story of us, our capacity to cooperate at scale, and our responsibility to do so wisely. In the ruins and archives, in languages and legal codes, in trade routes and tales passed down through generations, the past speaks. It tells us that building durable, just, and adaptable institutions is the true measurement of a civilization's lasting worth.